So here we are. This is episode 2 of Chairmen of the Boards. Today we're going to focus on basically everything to do with amp and cab sim. And is it, I guess, in my mind, is it really worth the hassle? So firstly, I guess here today, I am Grant from Goodwood Audio. We have, next up.
I'm Brian from Omilion Audio.
Sorry, I guess I had a delay. Sorry about that.
And a voice change.
I guess. Should we start that over again? Sorry, I'll go next. Are we good?
It's a conversation.
Okay, fine. This is Brian from Omilion Audio.
And I'm Mason from Vertex Effects.
So we have Grant, we have Brian from Omilion, we have another Brian from Omilion, and then we have Mason.
Right. Yeah,
exactly.
So
Brian's
I guess
been practicing his ventriloquist.
I guess today we're just gonna chat about amp and cab sim. I know I have some opinions on it myself, which I will hold off until later. But Brian, let's start with you, man. What are your general thoughts? Someone comes up to you for a rig and said, "Should I get an amp sim for my pedal board?" What goes through your mind?
It typically comes down to like the environment of which you're playing. You know, if they're allowed, stage volume 90% of the time, they're like, no stage volume. And I'll get some of those guys that are like, oh yeah, I can run a stereo amp rig on stage full blown. I'm like, okay, then, an amp sim might not be for you. But if they're like, no, I'm playing at my church, it has to be silent, I'll be like, all right. Well, we got, ACS1, Iridium, Simplifier Deluxe, Kemper. Like, there's so many options. It kind of depends on your budget, your space, and how you want, if you want it on a board or if you want, like, a rack or whatever. So it kind of depends on their situation, really. And sometimes it's like, oh, I just want convenience. So that, ends up being a huge factor. And for me, I have best of both worlds where I can do an amp sim or turn the amp sim off and just go straight into an amp. So like there's different options that you can be like, if all else fails, I have a backup. So
yeah. What about you, Mason? Any thoughts on amp or cab sim in general before we get into some specifics?
Well, as you guys probably know, I'm a kind of a tube amp pervert. And I got
what a title.
Tube amp perv. They'll be like the tagline,
the TAV,
the byline, yeah. I got all the old stuff. I've got old '60s Voxes and '60s Marshalls and '60s Fenders, so I'm very rooted in that. However, there have been some amp simulations that I've been very impressed with, getting to really compare it. Because a lot of us, when we do a comparison, or we say or exclaim to our fellow gear collector, it sounds just like X, but we've never played X. And so, sometimes those recommendations can be somewhat hollow in that they don't actually exemplify experience with the original unit. And as somebody who's really experienced the original units, I can say that there's a few that I've used that I thought, wow, like maybe this isn't the same thing, but I also don't need to buy a Kemper in order to get the sound of my twin reverb clean, or I don't need to buy, an Axe Effects to get the sound of a Marshall Plexi, or I don't need to buy fill in the blank digital modeling amp to get the sound of my Vox AC30. And so I think what'll be really cool about this conversation is we get to maybe see a good lateral view from sort of small pedal board based systems for amps that are not that expensive, all the way up to the toasters.
Yeah, love it. And I have to admit right at the outset here, I do not have the experience or the gear collection that you'd have of the vintage stuff. So I have more, for lack of a better term, modern stuff. Just picture me in a big room with a Mesa triple rec and a 7-string guitar. I mean, that's my playground, Totally kidding for anyone that doesn't actually know. I have no idea, but
Grant's got a lot of face tattoos. Just
exactly.
If you're not watching this,
3-inch spacers in my ears. Yeah, I've got it all, man. But I'm like a 1x12 combo, and like the less controls on the amp, the better, and that's what I absolutely love. And so that's where I guess the bias, if you want to say that, I take into listening to an amp and cab sim. I'm trying to find that sound that I'm comfortable with and the sound I've come to enjoy. But I think the thing I have to remember, and one of the things that people, even myself, I always find myself doing this, I compare an amp and cab sim and how good it sounds, with air quotes, to me sitting in front of my favorite amp having a jam. And I think I'd love to put it out there and get your guys' thoughts on saying that is not a fair comparison, because an amp and cab sim is simulating a mic'd up amp and cab. So if I wanted to do a fair comparison, I should really record my amp, listen to it through headphones, and then listen to an amp and cab sim with headphones and see what the similarities or differences are in that respect. Because you're never going to get that feeling of moving air in front of your face for an amp that is way too loud and you should be wearing earplugs. Like, it's just not gonna, you're not gonna get that same feel and kind of tactile approach to sitting in front of a real amp. So I don't know, like, there's always that part of the conversation of it's just not quite the same as my, like you were saying, Mason, my amp at home, or it's just not quite the same as this awesome Plexi I played 3 years ago. I've never been able to replicate it. Like, is that a fair comparison? How should people compare it, and how should they approach it with an amp and cab sim versus the amp that they're trying to emulate?
This is a good question.
It's a long-winded question, but I'm done.
But I know that Brian has an answer.
See, approaching, because I've played at some different mega churches in the DFW area where a lot of them have amp rooms and they sound great. They really do. Yep. But someone can be like, man, that AC30 and that Fender Deluxe sounds so great live. What are you doing? And sometimes it's mic'd up open in a room with lots of ventilation, and it's not in a box. When you start putting an amp in the box, or you put, say, like you run like a head into an ISO cabinet, an ISO cabinet even changes the whole sound of it. So where I have like the most simple of the Jackson amps, the Newcastle, like as simple as you possibly can get, like plugging that into a box like an ISO cabinet, it's dark and muffled, and it doesn't sound like what it would in front of me, because clearly there's a reason why cabinets were not built to be put into a box or capped. So I've had a lot of people that are like, man, I can't get that same tone out of my amp because I have to put it in a box, or I have to put it in a bathroom, and it has all these weird like high ends. It's like, well, because it depends on your environment. That's a huge part of it, is the environment of your amp and where it's going to be. If it's going to be sitting right next to you and you have all the stage volume and everything to do it, you'll get it to that sweet spot. But if you have to compromise with putting it in a closet where it's not ventilated, and you have to put foam padding around it to muffle it because the lady in the front row or whatever is going to be mad that she can hear, I don't know, whatever, that it kind of it'll muffle your overall perception of how you want it to sound. So that's where the direct in amp cab can kind of help alleviate some of that. Like, I use a direct in option because it sounds better in my ears. I would love to use my amp, but it's just not an option. It's just, I would compromise too much of my tone and hearing if I went with that option. So yeah.
Air compressor turns on? No.
No, it's actually off, right? I turned it off.
What do you think, Mason?
So I mean, I guess going back to the question of comparing, right? Like, what is the fair comparison? I think how you summarized it, I think, was the most appropriate, in that you can't compare. Well, first of all, you wouldn't really be able to compare them in the room unless, I guess, you had a wedge or something like that, and you put it next to your amp, and you were doing it that way, because there really isn't any simple way, at least that I'm coming up with right now, where you could put an Iridium or an ACS1 side by side, an amplifier, and be like, oh, here's the amp, here's the ACS1. I think invariably you're recording it, and I think putting it through that particular avenue, I would say sonically, listening back to the recording, I would say is actually where there's probably the least amount of difference when you're listening back. I think where there's the most amount of difference is maybe in the palpable feel that you get by using a tube amp, and maybe how you interact with it in that room, in the way that it feels and maybe inspires your playing, or alters your note choice based on sort of the type of feedback that you're getting from it. You know, you can't point your guitar at your cab simulator and get feedback. You know, I've tried.
Yeah,
it didn't work.
I've seen you.
So yeah. So there's that thing. But if you're looking back at them and you're listening back to, let's say, two tracks, let's say you split your signal and you have one side going directly into your amp and the other side going into your Iridium or ACS1, and you have two identical guitar tracks that you're listening to, and then you're just isolating one from the other. I think that you can get them to be pretty similar. And so I don't think that that's where probably the real difference is. I think the difference is in how it feels as a player. And I think to greater or lesser degrees, some people are uncompromised and they're like, I can only have this analog, moving a lot of air feel, where I have a 412 cabinet that's hitting me right in the chest, and I need that. Or, if you're in in-ears, it's gonna be a tough call. It's gonna be a tough call to really say, like in fact, this could be, we could Pepsi challenge some people,
Yep.
blindfold them, feed them something in their in-ears, and see if they can tell. This would be like a good game of tones. And you just see what they can do. If they can really tell. Because I think that's a hard differentiation, if you're not in the room with it.
I watched a video. It was an Anderton's A/B test, basically what you said, but it was a few years ago, so I don't remember too many specifics of it. But essentially, a Kemper into a powered Kemper, so it was moving air into a cab, versus the guy's actual amp. So the Kemper modeled his actual amp, so they were getting it as close as they could, all the details as close as possible. And he knew this amp like the back of his hand. A/B'd it, blindfolded, and he could not tell the difference. So the one variation there, he was actually using speakers for both A/B options. But in my experience, I have tried live. I'll say this live. I've tried live when I am the player to use an amp and cab sim only, rather than doing a real amp for dry and an amp and cab sim for wet. I've tried to just commit to one, and audibly in front of house, when you're listening back, I can't tell the difference. But when I'm playing, and I hope you guys can help me put words to this, or some awesome term that I can now use. I've never found a great term, but it just doesn't feel right. Like I'm losing this thing. As you can tell, I can't put words around it, but I'm not as inspired like you were saying, but it's a feel thing. Even when the amp is mic'd and I'm listening to it through my in-ears, the only word I can say is feel. It's just not quite there. Everything else, though, I listen to other people using Kempers or Iridiums, ACS1, whatever it is. I listen to it through front of house. I'm like, I have no idea. Are they using an amp and cab sim, or are they miking up an amp? I will never know until I ask them. But when I'm playing, the one differentiation is the feel. So I don't know if you guys have an awesome term for me, or if you can relate, or if I should just get over myself and commit to an amp and cab sim.
No, I agree with you completely.
Have you come up with a fix, or have you, what do you do about it? Because I want to be inspired when I play.
Yeah, I don't know. It's a whole different thing when, you got all that stage volume and you're feeling you're feeling the drums and the environment. I mean, I've been playing with in-ear monitors for over 10 or more years that like I've unfortunately come accustomed to it. I used to be in a band that we all had loud amps and 412s and stuff, and it was awesome and it sounded great and the energy and everything was there. And even when we do concerts, like here at the Sanctuary on this other side of my wall, you can feel the energy of the band is different when there's stage volume and air pushing and all that craziness, where then you get people that do direct and option, which we've had, and it just is like, it's like, does it feel weird? It's like, yeah, it does, like in general it does, but I have yet to find a fix for it. I blare my like ears as if I have stage volume. That's the only unfortunate thing, and my ears are gonna suffer eventually. But that's the only thing I've ever really been able to get for environment, like unfortunately. I mean, besides using the heck out of the room knob on my Iridium, that's about it.
Yep.
So
instant room.
Literally, like I remember I first played with it, I never had it on, and then I started turning it up, and it felt like it was like, I tell people it felt like it was next to me. I was like, okay, well this helps add some room. It feels like it's more in the room. So now I play with that like 1 or 2 depending on. If I go anywhere past 2, then it just feels weird. But yeah, that's a big deal. The room knob, even on the ACS1 has a room knob, and it makes a big difference.
Mm-hmm.
Any fixes for feel, Mason?
I think for feel, no. I don't know that I don't think I've ever gotten any of them to maybe feel exactly the same, but I think that may just be precipitated by, cabinets have that feel. As I said, you can't point your guitar at an ACS1 and get feedback, but I mean, I think that I think you sort of have to meet it where it is. It's replacing, 4 speakers, a preamp, a power amp, a microphone, a room.
Chiropractor visits.
You're right. Yeah. Yeah. So it's doing a lot of these things for you. And so I think, you have to acknowledge that there's going to be some amount of compromise, and that you're getting, all these things that, you're getting 3 amplifiers and 3 or more cabinets available to you, or whatever impulse responses you want to load in. And that makes it easy, and I think with what we're experiencing right now, with the possibility of, tubes becoming scarce, and there potentially not being as many options for the near future available to people, something like this could be a really good, viable option if you need to preserve, the tubes that you have. Perhaps you don't have spares, and you don't have any prospects to be able to get spares, and you're playing, multiple times a week, and this may be one way to kind of, keep the proverbial wolves at bay until, you have a better, line on getting some replacement tubes for your amplifier that, sometimes maybe you'll need to use for really specific stuff, and you need to kind of save it for those opportunities and use something like this in the meantime.
You just like a little bit, I guess, down that vein, you just put out a video on kind of addressing the tube shortage and kind of some hacks. I have to be totally honest, I haven't watched it yet. But basically that's what I was gathering. Is there anything you want to kind of summarize in this area if people are going back and forth between amp cab sim versus tubes, and giving them a couple?
Yeah, I think I didn't mention any cab sims as an alternate, in that I kind of kept it more tube specific, but I think to kind of summarize it for somebody who has no idea what this is really quickly is and by the way, I'm repping my Electro Harmonics beanie here, because they issued a statement, I think about 2 weeks ago, saying that due to the war in Ukraine between Russia, that the exportation of Russian tubes was now going to be something that wasn't going to be able to happen for the rest of the calendar year. And the consequence of that was that people sort of panic bought tubes the same way that people sort of panic bought toilet paper when the pandemic first started. And as a consequence of that, there are the prices of tubes on Reverb and places like that have increased like 400%. So there's a lot of price gouging. There's a lot of people that are attempting to take advantage of the scarcity in tubes, or what was predicted to be the scarcity of tubes. A week later, last Friday, Electro Harmonix issued a secondary statement saying, actually, we think they will be more available than originally thought, and we're going to be able to import them. However, there still aren't any tubes because everybody sort of took everything out of the marketplace because they were concerned about sort of the long-term prospects of what that could mean. And so I offered some insight as to other ways that you might be able to get tubes. And I think one of the things that is probably the most overlooked way that I've been doing for years is that in Craigslist, there's often free church organs that are listed for sale or for free. You just have to move them out of the church because a lot of the churches have moved away from those organs for a decade or two. And often these are replete with 6L6s, EL34s, or sorry, not EL34s, 6L6s, 12AX7s, almost never British tubes because almost all of these are American organs. But you can really get great vintage RCA, GE tubes out of these.
Wow.
And for the most part, they were used once a week, and the quality of those old American tubes is really superior to what's coming out now. And so even if they've been in use for 20 or 30 years, often they still have some life left in them, and you're getting not only a vintage tube, but in a lot of cases, a free vintage tube. And usually I just tell them like what I'm going to do with it. I said, hey, I have a bunch of tube amps, and this organ has complementary tubes that I could harvest from it. I will pay you for the tubes, or pay to have the organ hauled away if it's just something that's taking up space. And it's a great way to get vintage tubes. I just take a tube tester, and even if 50% of them work, to get a matched pair of 6L6s or a dozen 12AX7s that are from that generation, that could be $600 to $1,000 just right there. So that's one sort of hack if you if you're so inclined, where you can go and get some nice vintage tubes for little to no money and be able to use those in your amplifiers. And the second hack I talked about was that most of the EL34 tube amps that are vintage, let's say, old Marshalls, stuff like that, those actually didn't come with EL34s originally when they exported them, because the EL34 wasn't really available in America until the later part of the 70s and 80s. And so they would ship them to the U.S. without tubes, and then they would be tubed either with 6L6s or 5881s or 6550s, which are all, kind of in that 6L6 vein. And, sometimes it was a replacement of a screen resistor or sometimes just a bias thing. And you could use those American tubes in a British amplifier. And that's typically how they were, because you couldn't get EL34s here back then. And so a lot of people have forgotten about that, maybe you harvest some amps or some tubes from organs, and you can still change out your Marshall tubes, at least in a temporary sense, to work off of 6L6s or 5881s or, several different tube types that are kind of in that American style tube. So if you're harvesting organs, it sounds like, we're talking about like organ donors.
Yep.
If you're harvesting organs, you have a lot of options where you can actually use those tubes into similar amps. The Voxes are trickier. You don't have many options for EL84s, but EL34s, you definitely have options. 6L6s, 6V6s, you definitely have options for alternates.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
To me, that sounds like a very clever hack, but also a lot of effort. I'm just going to be totally honest, because I'm now thinking, well, now an amp and cab sim actually sounds pretty good, because currently my tubes are great, and and so the amp and cab sim thing in this current scenario, let's say tubes are going to be hard to come by for the next while, amp and cab sim might be a great short-term solution.
So, but what are the best ones? Because as I had told you earlier, I probably use one cab sim for every 10 that you guys use. So,
Yep.
I've used a few of them, but and I have one that I seem to like the best, at least of those I've tried. But I want to hear from the guys that are really using them all the time.
Come on,
Which
Brian.
are the ones that have the Goodwood and Omilion stamp of approval? What's on
It's
the
a-
Mount Rushmore
It's
of cab sims?
it's a literal stamp that we
Yeah.
stamp all of our cab sims with. Yep.
Literally.
All right, Mount Rushmore, let's do it.
I'm gonna say, are we picking two, one, two, or does it matter?
I mean, we could give a couple, maybe in no
Okay.
particular order. You know, I mean, they all have their assets.
Yeah. Well, I would say the Strymon Iridium and the Walrus ACS one. The Iridium is currently on my board, mainly because it's gonna sound funny. It's simple for me. Like, you pick the cab, you pick the amp, I have it on my board. I just don't want to
It's
lift
okay.
it up right now.
We believe you.
But it just has basic, there's not a lot of controls, which I like. I don't want all this craziness. I just literally want to pull it out of the case, make sure it's adjusted properly, and leave it. I don't want to have to do all the dip switches, where, like, if you really want to get into customizing each side, like the ACS1, you can pick the ABC or cab, you can pick left and right for each cab, you can pick the amp for each side, and, like, that's awesome. It really is cool, and I've had it on my board a couple of times, but I just found that I was doing too much of going the left side, tweaking this, going the right side, tweaking this, when the Iridium is that cabinet, that amp. I can, buy IRs and put it for each cabinet side, but I'm not that fancy. So those are my two favorite. The other things like the Simplifier and the Simplifier Deluxe or whatever, there's just a lot of options. So that's where I get down the road of, I don't need all those options. Simple is best for me.
I would say something similar. I recently did a test with a buddy here in Vancouver, and we basically went put the Iridium and the ACS1, HX Stomp, and a Helix all through front of house. So we weren't listening to ears; we were listening through, like, front of house speakers, and going back and forth. And I don't know if I'm allowed to say this on the podcast, but I wanted the Iridium to continue to be my favorite, and I absolutely love the Iridium.
Yeah.
But the ACS1 sounded really good. I was like, I wanted to be 100% faithful, but I was like, but it's a contender. Iridium and ACS1 are very much, in my mind, tonally, through the front of house speakers in that specific context, they sounded great. And
Yeah.
HX Stomp, I mean, that's multi-effects. It's amp and cab sim. It has, and it sounds awesome as well. But that's getting into a whole nother world of both cost and complexity. And then the Helix is another level on top of that. It just gets a bit crazy. So all that to say, those are all great options. Ones you might hear of a little bit less, but are by no means lower quality or something to consider any less. Anything from Two Notes, which is a French company. They do some great work, and they do, correct me if I'm wrong, on a bit of their gear, they also put in some preamp tubes as well, I guess, to try and get a little bit of that feel back, which leads me into one other thing I'm going to talk about in a sec, which is this preamp right behind me. But one other one to consider as well is, I think it's called Blug. Do you guys know much about that one?
The Thomas Blue, the blue guitar.
It's a bigger one. It's
Yeah.
a much bigger unit. But we did a setup for Chachi years ago, who played for Gang of Youths, and he is a geared nut. Like, every time he does a setup, he brings something in I've never heard of, never seen, but he swears by. Like, he just loves his gear, and that was one of them. And brought it in. I was like, man, this thing sounds awesome. It is massive. It's not cheap, but it sounded great. So there's just so much out there. If I had to put one on my personal board right now, I would probably, out of stubbornness, still do the Iridium, but ACS1 is also great. And then the only other hack I would have for you guys to consider is this is a Kingsley Squire. It's a 2 preamp. Like these guys, they do a great job. And just down the road, actually, from me here up in Canada, but it's a 2 preamp. And the best sound I've gotten out of my Iridium is when I ran all of my dry effects, so overdrives, distortion, compression, all that. Then I put the 2 preamp in there in my signal chain, always on. Then directly after my 2 preamp comes the Iridium, and then I go into all my modulation, delay, reverb out to front house. And that I probably would say if you're on a budget, it's not worth it to invest in a preamp pedal. But if you're trying to replace an amp, get the best possible sound out of your amp and cab sim, and that's what you want to commit to, then for under $1,000, you can get an Iridium and a 2 preamp and start experimenting and seeing what you can do. And my only theory, this is conjecture. I have no idea if this is actually what's happening. My theory with putting a preamp right before the Iridium is that you can set your Iridium sound to the preamp and the Iridium, and then everything feeding that preamp after the fact, changing overdrives, changing compression, is a bit more tamed and evened out and more consistent. And so you can get this sound that is a bit more predictable across all the changing dynamics of your board. And so that's the best sound I've gotten is a 2 preamp right before an Iridium. RC booster works, like clean overdrives also work as a preamp. But yeah, I don't know if you guys have any kind of hacks, tips, or tricks for getting just that little bit more out of your amp and cab sim, or where you might even run it in your signal chain, because that's also a big thing. Me telling people I run it in the middle of my signal chain might be blasphemy to some who run it right at the end, but I'd be curious what your guys' thoughts are on that as well.
I mean, I'm going to say off the bat, it threw me off when a coworker came in and was like, I want to put my ACS1 before my delay and reverbs. And I was like, why? I'm like I have never had anyone really request it that way. And I was like, oh, okay, why? And he kind of explained it to me. And then literally the next day, we all had a conversation about it. And I was like, I'm going to go and try it. I'm going to try it. And as you guys can see from our text conversation yesterday, I have left it that way. So I am now doing it the same way that you do it, Grant. And it's awesome. There's more clarity out of it. You know, it just, the overall board just responded differently for me. And yeah, if anything, if I run a preamp with it, I run like the Jackson Prism in amp mode. Like that's it. But yeah, that's for me.
Any thoughts, Mason?
Yeah, I think that running any of the processing effects after your sim is best. And the reason that I say that is if you're thinking about it in a studio context, let's say, you would ordinarily have all of your processing after the microphone, which is essentially what you're doing when you have the delays and reverbs and, you know, modulation running after the cab sim, because it's basically what you're getting on the output is the mic'd cab of whatever amplifier simulation you've done. And the only drawbacks with it that I just think that some people maybe don't address appropriately is that the outputs of most of the cab sims that I'm aware of are very low output impedance, because they want you to be able to take an unbalanced line and drive it back to potentially even your mixing board. You know, if you got 100 ohm output impedance from an Iridium, you could probably drive 100 feet or more of regular guitar cable and really have no loss or anything like that occurring, because it's such a low output impedance. But when you're running other pedals after it, you know, pedals don't have any standards as far as how low the output impedances are. So, you know, you could have, if you went out of the Iridium, you'd have 100 ohms. You could go out of a Boss pedal and have 1,000 ohms, which is, you know, 10 times worse than, you know, the Iridium. And so I just think that the thing that people need to be aware of if they're going to do post effects after their sim, they either need to have a really good buffer at the end of it. So that could be, you know, a Goodwood audio interfacer. That could be a DIY buffer that we show how to do on, our YouTube channel. Or that could even be just getting an SGI or a pinstripe or something like that. That's basically just going to convert, it to a low impedance or balanced signal from an unbalanced single-ended signal, so that it can go, where our boards are, the mixing board is relative to our pedal boards could be wildly different from stage to stage. And so sometimes having something like that, like again, an SGI, pinstripe, whatever it is, this is something that could be valuable if you really need to go a really long distance and it's not something that the buffer is going to be able to cover effectively, or if they just want to have an XLR going into the board, and so they don't want that 1/4 inch, unbalanced cable. But I just think that that's something that people need to be aware of. And I think as far as the Sims are concerned, I'm in agreement with Grant that I think that the Walrus is the best to my ear. And I did notice, speaking of tone pervs, that some people were perving out on it because it didn't have analog drive-through. And I feel like this is a thing that people have gotten real wound up on, that like for some reason if it doesn't have analog drive-through, it means that it's somehow like an inferior product. I've seen people say this about the H9. A lot of the Eventide stuff is not analog drive-through. Some of the Line 6 stuff, especially like the DL4, wasn't analog drive-through.
It's the new true bypass.
Well, I think that they're looking at it all wrong. I mean, like I think a lot of the companies do it because, if you're talking about using multiple digital effects together, and you're trying to prevent, I think that people think there's going to be some sort of latency associated with it. I think if you're really that concerned about it, you could, of course, throw whatever the non-analog drive-through product is into a mixer, and like a parallel mixer. And now you got your dry signal back. But I predict if you do this test, you're not going to hear any difference in the latency, whether you use it in a mixer or not. Like most of these companies are not dumb. Like they're not going to give you something that you really don't like or that really is inferior. And if you do the test, I think you'll be hard pressed to detect any difference between any latency that may be occurring in an ACS1 versus an Iridium versus a simplifier versus two notes. I think that they're all great in that regard, and they're just different approaches to get you to the same place. And I think just because it has a word like analog in it doesn't mean that it's any more or less viable. At the end of the day, these are all digital models of an amplifier. And I think the cool thing about the ACS1 that I really like is that I don't always like having the same exact cabinet and amplifier on both sides of the stereo image. It can be really cool to mix Fender and Vox or Fender and Marshall. And having the ability to do that is to my knowledge, is only capable on the ACS1, where you can mix your amplifiers and your cabs and have them different on the left and right, which I think is a really cool feature if you want to be able to really sort of mix and match the tones that you're getting.
Yeah. I'm gonna say too, I don't hate the Iridium, the ACS1. I do love it. I completely agree with you guys. I don't have time to do all that fine tuning, so I will say the ACS1 does have that upper leg of being able to compare, do those two sides, an AC30 and a Fender. Because if I can play an AC30 and a Fender Deluxe live somewhere, heck yeah, I'm gonna do it because it sounds amazing. I can do it on the ACS1 if I have the time to sit down and do it, but because of my normal workload and my home life with the kids and my wife and everything, it just doesn't make sense for me particularly. But I completely agree with you guys. It is an amazing compact tool, and the fact that you can do the USB in and do all the tweaking and firmware updates, I mean, it's insane what they can do.
The MIDI, I think, is easier to access too.
Yes.
On it too.
The 5-pin over doing the TRS on the Iridium stuff, you get the people. I get it all the time. Oh, can you make me this certain pin configuration for the Iridium? I'm like, man, just go buy a MIDI box 4 from Disaster Area. Like, you can switch those dip switches on it, and it's done. Where it's 5-pin. You don't have to set the through. Like, all that kind of stuff is already good to go.
And
Yeah.
the one thing I will say, I know I'm trying to stay true to my Strymon guys, but Iridium, the MIDI port also needs to be isolated as well. So you can't
Yes.
just do, depending on your MIDI configuration, you can't just do a converter cable. It would be better to buy one of Strymon's isolated cables,
Yeah.
so you don't get any ground loops in your MIDI chain as well. There is one other downside, I have to say, to running your amp and cab sim in the middle of your chain, which is important to consider, is you immediately lose the use of your headphone out on the amp and cab sim, unless you're happy with just getting your dry effects, which if you've got a great dry section, maybe that's good enough for you. But if you think about it logically, you're going to run guitar into overdrives into Iridium or ACS1, whatever it is, and the amp and cab sim is only going to see what's come before, and then your delays and reverbs modulation gets added on after the fact. So your headphone out will not see delays, reverbs, and modulation. So if that's important, at-home practice, easily plugging in your headphone jack, I would still say either put it in something where you can easily change the order of your signal chain, like a PBC6X or something like that, or just put it at the end, and it might be better for you for it to sound just a little bit, maybe not as clear, or whatever the word is.
Or an easy solution too that I've recommended to some people that have brought this up to us before is Rolls, ROLLS, makes headphone amps that are inexpensive. They're very linear, so it's it would very much represent kind of just like listening through the amount of color that a wedge would have.
Perfect.
You could they also have a mixer that you could do this with, where it's a stereo mixer where you can feed in a left and a right, and you can pan them like you would on a mixing board, and it also has a headphone output. And I think it takes 12 volts. It comes with its own power supply. It's really small, smaller than an ACS1. And you could use that as basically your headphone amp to receive things. And I think that they're like $60 or $80.
Perfect.
Made in USA, bulletproof, and that's a really good way if you want to sort of represent what the board would look like. If you want to hard pan those left and right signals, you can do that in there. And it actually has 3 inputs too. So if you did have a dry like you have, Brian, you could throw the dry into one channel too.
Oh, that's cool.
And so it's like a 3-channel stereo mixer. So it's pretty cool in what it does, and you could get those very inexpensively. The headphone output is very good.
So you could also maybe put a MP3 in as well and practice with a song. Is that what you're saying with the 3 channels?
You could do that too. I mean, I was just thinking if you had a dry, you could leave that mix control straight up, because usually in a wet, dry, wet, hard pan left and right, dry straight up. You could do that on the Rolls, and they have a bunch of solutions for headphone amps that are really good, and they're very reasonable. I don't even think I could find a version of their mixer and headphone amps that's more than $100. You can get them on Amazon.
That's awesome.
Yeah,
That's good for me because I don't pick up a guitar unless I'm playing wet, dry, wet personally.
yeah.
So for my needs,
Right.
very, very high maintenance. That's perfect.
Grant's Rider. It's almond butter, blue M&Ms, and
Organic.
wet, dry, wet.
Blue M&Ms.
That's great. I mean, I personally don't have a whole lot more that I feel like I can add to the conversation on amp and cab sims. But let's say there's someone listening. They just ran out of tubes. They've purged their church organ. Nothing left there. They're considering an amp and cab sim. What are like a couple of points? Just overview. What would you say? You're about to go and get an amp and cab sim. These are the main things you want to consider when making a purchase. What would you guys say?
I'll say don't go for like the cheap option. Like I'm not saying go spend $1,000 or whatever. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is don't be like, oh, I happen to say I needed, an amp cab simulator, and a company comes up with one for $100. Don't buy it. Like, don't buy like $100. You're gonna pay for what you get, basically. So do your research. Don't make your determination off of a YouTube video only. if that's your only option because you live out in the middle of nowhere and you don't have a guitar shop nearby that has it, then fine, do that. But go to your local guitar shop that has one, borrow a friend's, call your neighbor, whatever, and like test it out and mess with it. And also, I've learned this the hard way. Don't buy the new pedal, completely redo your board, get it all perfect, and you're like, I hate this. Like, I've done it so many times. I'm like, I love this pedal that I got, and it's massive. Like this, all this, and you reconfigure everything. Don't do any of that until you've actually tried it. Take it there. That's functional and maybe looks messy. I do it all the time. I have rat nest boards, and people look at me and they're like, "Didn't you do this as your job?" I'm like, "Don't talk to me. Don't ask. I'm testing something out." Like the wet dry wet was a mess, but it worked. So now it's all nice. So that's what I would say, personally.
Love it.
Yeah, I think I agree with all that, and I think I would just say that you need to. I think the vetting thing is important. Make sure that whatever you choose is cooperative with the gear that you have. I think experimenting with the sort of amp simulation at the end of the chain versus after your drive section, and then having all the wet effects and processing after it. I think that's worth experimenting with to see what you like, because some people do just like running everything into the front of the amp, and if you like the behavior of all your effects in that sense, then running everything into your Iridium or your ACS1 or fill in the blank is probably the best way to do it. But if you wanted to kind of have more of like a studio sound, running the wet effects after your simulated amp and cabinet sounds is beneficial. I think considering what you're going to do to get it back into the mixing board is important. If you have high quality pedals that have good quality buffers in them, like the Strymon pedals, if you're using a Big Sky or a Timeline or stuff like that, those have pretty low output impedances that mirror exactly what the Iridium would have if you were going straight out of that. Those are pretty good. Those could drive, a 100-foot cable, no problem. Also might be a consideration to think about getting SGIs, a pinstripe, something of that nature, so that you can convert it to a balanced signal and you can get an XLR feed into the board. So these are just things to consider depending on how far away you are from the connections of the board and if you need to convert it to a balanced signal. I think overarching too, which we didn't really talk about, but I think we got there, is that you don't necessarily need to buy a Kemper or an Axe Effects. I feel like those all have great options in them, but I feel like if you are a person that's used to a pedal board into an amp, this is a way more complementary direction to go, because you can really repurpose everything about your rig as it was going into an amp, pop this into the signal path, and you're exactly where you were. The interface of everything is exactly the same. You've just substituted your Fender amp for this ACS1 or for this Iridium. You don't have to learn the software language of an Axe Effects or of a Kemper and program a foot switch controller for the whole thing. This is like the path of least resistance if you're making that switch.
I would definitely agree. I think personally, if I was going to play my last gig tomorrow, I would be picking up an amp, a real amp, a tube amp with tubes that work. But
for now.
Exactly. But having an amp and cab sim as something that is kind of like I was saying earlier, something that's like a tool in your arsenal and something that's available to you, man, they are convenient and they can make a grab and go board so easy. If you do fly dates, if you don't want to play that much, or if you're just playing once a week and you don't have much room in your car, or you got kids, like what Brian was saying, and car seats, and you got to choose child or amp, pause for a second and just make the right choice. But yeah, I think for me, the biggest thing I would say, if you're looking at getting an amp and cab sim, kind of mirroring what Brian said, is not all of them are created equal. I have played a lot of them, of which I will not name, and I plug them in and they do not sound good. There's a reason why people keep talking about the Iridium versus the ACS1. Like, they're both awesome products, and there's a bunch of other awesome products out there as well that we've mentioned today. But there are some out there that, to save $100 versus being a little bit more inspired, or just it sounds a little bit more like what you're going for every single time you play, it's probably worth it to save up a little bit more and get the one that you'll love, rather than a quick fix. So that's all I would say is, again, try it out first if you can, like what Brian said. Test it out in your signal chain in multiple spots. Don't rush it. Don't just chuck it down and hope for the best. Take your time with it, and I think you'll be a lot more pleased with the results after you've done that. So yeah, I mean, I've already learned a bunch. Even just that headphone amp, Mason, that you mentioned, the rolls, that sounds incredible, and a great fix for one of these problems that I've always, like, losing the headphone jack for some people is not, it's not worth it. So get a headphone amp that's affordable and does a great job, and now maybe you can kind of have the best of both worlds. So
yeah, I think the one that I use, if I needed to do that, is called the Roll Stereo Line Mixer.
Great.
And I think it's $60 on Amazon. It's made in the USA, steel enclosure, built like a tank. It's the best $60 you've ever spent.
Awesome.
And if it doesn't work out, you can use it as a paperweight.
Of which I'm always in need of.
Right. So when you're on that picnic, it's your napkins aren't going to fly away.
Love it. Love it. So, I mean, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions after this, because we've gone in detail, but it's still a broad topic. Mason, you're kind of curating this whole thing. Where should people reach out? Where's the best place to ask a question, get in touch?
Well, I think if you're listening to this, you'll have limited options to do that. Less like we have people asking questions in the Apple reviews.
Yep, perfect.
So I would say that the best place is actually to find it on YouTube, because it'll be on the Vertex Effects channel, under the playlist headline Chairmen of the Boards, and you could find this episode about amp and cab simulations, episode 2, and we'll be able to answer the questions there. We'll all have access to it. I think we all have YouTube channels that have our branded logos on it, so you'll know who's responding. And I think that's probably the best way to have the most interaction. I guess they could also email us, but whatever. I think probably the YouTube is the most appropriate. That way other people too can benefit from your question and the answer, because if people are finding it there, they can look at it, they can reflect on it themselves, they can ask a follow-up question, whereas if it's through email, that answer is just specific to that one person, and that information exchange gets lost. So let's make it as egalitarian as possible. Democratic answers, everybody gets to view it. Go to YouTube, have a look, leave a comment.
Perfect.
Love it.